June 12, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for more than a month, but for 23 German women stepping off a military transport truck in the scorching Texas heat, their personal war was just beginning. Camp Hearne sat in the flat countryside outside Bryan, Texas, a sprawling facility that had housed thousands of German prisoners during the war. Now, as the repatriation process ground slowly through bureaucratic channels, this small group of women from the German Women's Auxiliary Corps found themselves in a strange limbo between captivity and freedom. Ilse Brandt stood among them, her gray auxiliary uniform stained with dust from the long journey. At 24 years old, she had served as a radio operator in Cologne before her capture near the Belgian border in the final chaotic weeks of the war. She clutched a small canvas bag containing everything she still owned in the world: a change of clothes, a photograph of her family, and a book of poetry she had carried through 3 years of service. The other women around her maintained the same rigid posture they had been trained to hold, even in defeat. Their faces showed nothing but careful neutrality. Captain Eleanor Whitmore emerged from the camp administration building, her crisp uniform a stark contrast to the disheveled appearance of the new arrivals. She was younger than Ilse had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to assess everything at once. Behind her stood 2 guards: Corporal Emmett Caldwell, a lanky man with a slow southern drawl, and Private Virgil Thatcher, barely old enough to shave, whose nervous fidgeting suggested this was his first assignment dealing with enemy prisoners. "Welcome to Camp Hearne," Captain Whitmore said in clear, measured English. Her tone was neither warm nor hostile, simply professional. "You will be housed in Barracks 7. You will follow camp regulations, attend roll call twice daily, and work assignments will be determined tomorrow. Medical inspection will occur in 1 hour. Any questions?" The German women remained silent. They had been instructed during transport not to speak unless directly addressed, not to show emotion, not to give their captors any reason to single them out for punishment. Ilse's hands tightened around her canvas bag. She had heard stories about American prison camps, whispered rumors that had circulated among German soldiers during the final months of the war. Stories of beatings, of deliberate starvation, of prisoners worked to death in the brutal heat. Looking at the armed guards and the barbed wire fence surrounding the compound, she wondered how much truth those stories contained. What Ilse didn't know, what none of the women could have possibly imagined as they stood in that formation under the merciless Texas sun, was that within 3 days, everything they believed about their American captors would be shattered. It would happen in the most unexpected way possible, not through violence or cruelty, but through something far more powerful. It would happen over a plate of fried chicken. The first 48 hours at Camp Hearne passed in tense silence. The German women moved through their routines like ghosts, speaking only in whispered German during the brief moments they were left alone in their barracks. They lined up for meals, stood for roll call, and followed orders with mechanical precision. Ilse noticed that the American guards seemed almost uncomfortable with their rigid compliance, as if they had expected something different. Dorothea Fisher, whom everyone called Dora, had the bunk next to Ilse's. At 22, she was one of the youngest in the group, a former clerk from Dresden who still carried herself with the careful posture of someone trying to appear older than her years. On their second night, as the lights dimmed in the barracks, Dora whispered in German, "They haven't hit anyone yet." Ilse turned her head slightly. "It's only been 2 days. Still," Dora continued, her voice barely audible, "the stories we heard, they said Americans were brutal to prisoners, that they would mock us, abuse us. But that young one, the private, he helped Hedwig carry her mattress when she struggled with it." Hedwig Roth, at 26, was the eldest among them and had quickly become their unofficial leader. She had served as a medical assistant in Stuttgart before her capture and carried herself with quiet authority. She sat on her bunk now, watching the younger women with concern. "Don't mistake exhaustion for kindness," she said softly in German. "They're soldiers, We're enemies. That hasn't changed just because the shooting stopped." But Ilse had noticed things too, small things that didn't match the propaganda they had been fed. The way Corporal Caldwell had made sure each woman received the same portion of food during meals, not favoring or withholding. The way Captain Whitmore had personally ensured the barracks had adequate blankets despite the summer heat, making them unnecessary at night. The way Private Thatcher had jumped to attention when one of the German women had stumbled on the steps, reaching out instinctively to steady her before remembering himself and stepping back awkwardly. These observations troubled Ilse more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she could understand. Cruelty fit the narrative she had been given about Americans, that they were ruthless, that they saw Germans as subhuman, that they would exact revenge for the war. But this careful neutrality, this almost nervous politeness, suggested something more complicated. It suggested that perhaps the Americans didn't know what to do with them either. During their second evening meal, Ilse caught sight of someone new in the camp kitchen. A black man in an army uniform, older than most of the guards, working over enormous pots with the focused attention of someone who took his craft seriously. She had never seen a black person before coming to America. Nazi propaganda had taught her to expect savagery, to fear such encounters. But watching this man carefully seasoning food that would feed prisoners, enemy prisoners, she felt the first small crack forming in the wall of certainty she had built around herself. By the third day, small gestures began to accumulate into something that couldn't be ignored. Private Virgil Thatcher brought extra water during the afternoon heat when he noticed several women looking pale and exhausted. He didn't speak, just set down additional canteens and moved on. But the action itself spoke louder than words. Corporal Emmett Caldwell, with his slow southern manner, had begun learning a few German phrases, badly pronounced but earnest. "Guten Morgen," he would say during morning roll call, and some of the women would automatically respond before catching themselves. Ilse found herself watching the Americans more closely than she had watched anyone in years. During her time in the Auxiliary Corps, she had been trained to follow orders without question, to see the world in the clear categories her superiors provided. But here, those categories were blurring. These Americans didn't act like conquerors or like the vengeful enemies she had been warned about. They acted like people doing an uncomfortable job trying to maintain professionalism while dealing with a situation none of them had trained for. It was Captain Whitmore who initiated the first real conversation. She approached Ilse during a work detail where the German women were helping to organize supply inventories. "You speak English," the captain said. It wasn't a question. Ilse had been translating quietly for some of the other women who struggled with the language. "Some," Ilse replied carefully, keeping her eyes down. "Good. I need someone who can help with communication. There's going to be paperwork for your repatriation, and I'd rather have accurate translations than misunderstandings." Captain Whitmore paused, then added, "I'm told you were a radio operator. That requires education, technical skill." Ilse nodded, unsure where this was leading. "I want you to understand something," the captain continued, her voice lowering slightly. "You're not here to be punished. You're here because there's a process, a legal framework for repatriation that takes time. But while you're here, you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. That means humanely." The word hung in the air between them. Humanely. Ilse had heard that term before, in German military briefings about how they supposedly treated their own prisoners. She had never quite believed it then, and she wasn't sure she believed it now. But something in Captain Whitmore's direct gaze suggested the woman actually meant what she said. That evening, Hedwig gathered the women in their barracks after lights out. "We need to be careful," she whispered in German. "This kindness could be a trap. They might be trying to make us comfortable, to get us to reveal information, to trust them before they strike." But Dora, young and increasingly hopeful, shook her head. "What information do we have that matters? The war is over. Germany surrendered. What could we possibly tell them that would make any difference now?" Sunday morning arrived with a different energy in Camp Hearne. The routine remained the same. Roll call at dawn, breakfast at 700 hours, work assignments posted by 8. But something in the air felt charged with anticipation. Ilse noticed the American guards seemed more relaxed, talking among themselves with easy camaraderie. Private Thatcher was whistling tunelessly as he walked his patrol route. Even Captain Whitmore, usually all business, had a slight softness around her eyes that suggested something beyond the daily grind of managing prisoners. It was Corporal Caldwell who let slip the reason during morning roll call. "Big meal coming this afternoon," he said to Private Thatcher, loud enough for the assembled prisoners to hear. "Sergeant Washington's been in that kitchen since 0500. Says he's cooking like he's back home in Georgia, feeding Sunday congregation after church." Ilse translated quietly for the women around her, though she wasn't entirely sure what the corporal meant by Sunday congregation. In Germany, Sunday meals had become meager affairs by 1943, and by the final year of the war, the concept of a special Sunday dinner had disappeared entirely. The idea that prisoners, enemy prisoners, would receive anything beyond basic sustenance seemed improbable. During their morning work detail, organizing medical supplies in one of the storage buildings, Dora moved closer to Ilse. "Do you think it's true about the meal?" Her voice carried a hope that made Ilse uncomfortable. Hope felt dangerous. Hope meant letting down the careful guards they had all constructed. "I don't know," Ilse replied. "Maybe it's for the American soldiers, not for us." But throughout the morning, delicious smells began drifting across the compound from the direction of the camp kitchen. Rich, savory aromas that made Ilse's stomach clench with sudden hunger. She hadn't smelled anything like this in years. During the final months in Germany, food had been reduced to its most basic forms. Thin soups, hard bread, whatever could be scrounged or rationed. The idea of food prepared for pleasure rather than mere survival had become foreign. By noon, when the women were dismissed from their work details and told to return to barracks to clean up before the afternoon meal, the entire compound was filled with those incredible smells. Hedwig, ever cautious, gathered the younger women around her. "Remember who we are," she said firmly in German. "Remember that we are prisoners. Whatever this is, whatever they're planning, we maintain our dignity. We don't beg, we don't grovel, and we don't forget ourselves." But even as Hedwig spoke those words, Ilse saw her swallow hard, saw the way her eyes flickered toward the kitchen building, saw the same hunger and confusion and desperate hope that Ilse felt rising in her own chest. At 1400 hours, the German women were escorted to the camp dining hall. The moment they stepped through the doors, everything they thought they understood about their captivity shattered. Long tables had been set with actual plates, not the tin mess kits they had been using. At the center of each table sat platters piled high with golden brown fried chicken surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, corn on the cob, biscuits, and gravy. The sight was so overwhelming that several women stopped in their tracks, causing a confused shuffle behind them. Sergeant Booker Washington stood near the kitchen entrance, a tall man in his 40s with graying hair and steady hands. He wore a clean apron over his uniform and watched the prisoners' reactions with quiet attention. Beside him, Corporal Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing the emotional storm about to break. "Please sit down," Captain Whitmore said, gesturing to the tables. Her voice was gentle, almost careful. "This is Sunday dinner. In the South, it's tradition after church. Sergeant Washington has prepared this meal for everyone at the camp, and that includes you." The women moved slowly to their seats, their military training the only thing keeping them upright. Ilse found herself sitting directly in front of one of the chicken platters. The pieces were enormous, glistening with seasoning and perfectly crispy coating. Steam rose from the mashed potatoes. Real butter sat in small dishes within reach. Her hands trembled as she placed them in her lap. "Go ahead," Corporal Caldwell said. "Don't be shy, there's plenty more where that came from." Dora was the first to reach out. Her hand shook as she took a piece of chicken and set it on her plate. Then, as if a dam had broken, she picked it up with both hands and bit into it. The sound she made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Tears immediately began streaming down her face, but she didn't stop eating. She couldn't stop. Within moments, all 23 women were eating with a desperation that transcended hunger. This wasn't about filling empty stomachs. This was about years of deprivation, of propaganda, of fear, all colliding with the reality of enemy soldiers who had prepared a feast for them. Ilse bit into her own piece of chicken and felt tears burning her eyes. The seasoning was complex, perfectly balanced, the meat tender and juicy beneath the crispy coating. It was the best thing she had tasted in 5 years. Around the table, women were crying openly while eating. Hedwig, their stoic leader, had her face buried in her hands between bites, her shoulders shaking. A young woman named Kristen was sobbing so hard she could barely chew, but she kept reaching for more. The Americans stood back, clearly unprepared for this reaction. Private Thatcher looked stricken, as if he had done something wrong. Sergeant Washington's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes were soft. Ilse looked down at her plate, at the abundance that seemed impossible, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. She had been taught that Americans were cruel, that they would starve and abuse their prisoners. But here was truth, undeniable and overwhelming. Here was kindness she had no framework to understand. The meal lasted nearly 2 hours, though no one kept precise track of time. The German women ate until they physically couldn't eat anymore, then sat in stunned silence, staring at the remains on their plates. Ilse's stomach ached from the richness and quantity of food, an unfamiliar discomfort after years of barely adequate rations. Around her, the other women looked similarly dazed, their faces still wet with tears they had stopped trying to hide. Sergeant Washington and his kitchen staff began clearing dishes, moving quietly around tables full of women who seemed unable to process what had just happened. The sergeant paused beside Ilse's table, noting the picked clean chicken bones, the empty bowls that had held mashed potatoes and gravy. "Hope you enjoyed it," he said simply. His voice was deep and warm, with a Georgia accent that softened the edges of his words. "Why?" The question escaped Ilse's mouth before she could stop it. She looked up at him, searching his face for some answer that would make sense of this. "Why would you do this for us?" Sergeant Washington was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "Sunday dinner ain't about who deserves what," he finally said. "It's about remembering that we're all human beings, even when the world tries to convince us otherwise. My mama taught me that. Said, the Lord don't make exceptions about who gets fed at the table." After he moved on, Dora leaned close to Ilse. "I don't understand," she whispered. In German, "We're supposed to be the enemy. We're supposed to be punished for what our country did. But this was kindness. Real kindness." Hedwig, sitting across from them, had regained some of her composure, though her eyes remained red. "Perhaps that's exactly why they did it," she said thoughtfully. "To confuse us, to make us forget ourselves, to break down our resistance." But even as she spoke those words, Hedwig didn't sound convinced. None of them did. Because whatever the motivation, the reality remained undeniable. American soldiers, men and women, who should have hated them, who had every right to treat them with contempt, had instead prepared a feast and watched with concern as they broke down crying over it. Private Thatcher approached their table hesitantly, carrying a pitcher of water to refill glasses. "Are you all okay?" he asked, his young face creased with worry. "We didn't mean to upset anybody. Sergeant Washington just thought, that everybody deserves a good meal, especially on Sunday." "We are not upset," Ilse managed to say in English, though her voice was thick with emotion. "We are grateful and confused, and we do not know how to feel both things at once." The private nodded slowly, as if he understood something that Ilse herself was still struggling to grasp. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I reckon war does that to people, makes everything complicated." That night in the barracks, no one spoke for a long time. The women lay in their bunks, hands resting on full stomachs, trying to reconcile what they had experienced with everything they had been taught about their captors. The morning after the Sunday dinner, Ilse woke before dawn with her mind spinning. She had dreamed of her mother's kitchen in Cologne, of Sunday dinners from before the war, when food was abundant and the world made sense. But the dream had mixed with reality, her mother's face blurring into Sergeant Washington's steady expression, her father's voice becoming Corporal Caldwell's slow drawl. She lay in the darkness trying to separate what she had been taught from what she had experienced, and finding the line between them increasingly impossible to locate. During morning roll call, Captain Whitmore announced that work assignments would include helping in the camp kitchen for those who volunteered. Several hands went up immediately, including Dora's. Ilse raised her own hand before she could reconsider. She needed to understand. She needed to see if the kindness from yesterday was an aberration or something more fundamental. By 800 hours, Ilse and 5 other German women found themselves in Sergeant Washington's kitchen. The space was larger than she had expected, with industrial stoves, enormous pots, and shelves stocked with more food than she had seen in years. The sergeant was already at work preparing lunch, his movements efficient and practiced. "Any of you know your way around a kitchen?" he asked. When several women nodded, he began assigning tasks with the same matter-of-fact competence that he brought to everything. "You 3 can start on vegetables. Peeling, chopping, nothing fancy. You 2 help Private Chen with the bread dough, and you," he pointed to Ilse, "you can help me with the seasoning." As they worked, Ilse found herself standing beside the sergeant at the main preparation counter. He was mixing spices for the chicken they would serve later, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times. "You want to know why?" he said suddenly, not looking at her. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ilse admitted. "My granddaddy was born a slave," Sergeant Washington said quietly, continuing to work as he spoke. "Grew up being told he wasn't quite human, that he was property, that people like him didn't deserve basic dignity. After emancipation, he spent his whole life proving them wrong just by being decent, by treating folks with respect even when they didn't return it." He paused, measuring out pepper with precise attention. "I figure if he could do that, knowing what had been done to him and his people, then I can surely cook a good meal for some scared young women who got caught up in something bigger than they understood." The words settled over Ilse like weight. She thought about the propaganda she had been fed, about the lies she had believed, about how easy it had been to accept simple stories about who was good and who was evil. Standing in this kitchen, watching this black man, whom Nazi ideology had taught her to consider inferior, demonstrate more humanity than most of the officers she had served under, Ilse felt something crack open inside her chest. Over the following days, a cautious rhythm developed in the camp. The German women continued their work assignments, but the atmosphere had shifted after that Sunday dinner. Conversations began to happen, halting and awkward at first, between guards and prisoners. Corporal Caldwell would ask about German weather while escorting work details. Private Thatcher shyly showed photographs of his family farm in Arkansas to anyone who expressed interest. Captain Whitmore instituted informal English lessons during evening hours for prisoners who wanted to improve their language skills. Ilse found herself drawn into more of these interactions than she had anticipated. Her English was already functional, but she attended the evening lessons anyway, partly to help translate for the other women, partly because she was curious about the Americans teaching them. Corporal Caldwell led most of these sessions, his patient Southern drawl making even difficult pronunciation seem manageable. One evening after lessons ended, the corporal asked Ilse to stay behind. She felt a flutter of anxiety, old fears about what being singled out by a guard might mean. But Caldwell simply pulled out a folded letter from his pocket, looking embarrassed. "My sister sent this," he said. "She's about your age. Teaches school back in South Carolina. She heard we had German prisoners here, and she wrote asking me what y'all are like. I was wondering if maybe you might help me write back, help me explain things properly." Ilse took the letter carefully, reading the neat handwriting. The sister, whose name was Ruth, had written with genuine curiosity rather than hostility. She asked if the German women were frightened, if they had families waiting for them, if they understood English, if they seemed like normal people or like the monsters propaganda had portrayed. The questions were direct and honest in a way that caught Ilse off guard. "What do you want to tell her?" Ilse asked. Corporal Caldwell sat down heavily on one of the classroom benches. "The truth, I suppose, that y'all are just regular folks who got caught up in something terrible, that most of you seem scared and confused and homesick, that when Sergeant Washington served that chicken dinner, you cried like it was the first kindness you'd seen in years." And maybe it was. He looked at Ilse directly. "I want to tell her that the enemy don't look much like an enemy when you're sharing a meal with them." They spent the next hour drafting a response together. Ilse helped Caldwell find words to describe the complexity of the situation, how the German women maintained their dignity while clearly struggling with what their country had done, how they worked hard and followed rules and seemed genuinely grateful for basic decency. In return, Caldwell shared stories about his sister, about his hometown, about a world so far removed from war that it seemed almost fictional to Ilse. As she walked back to the barracks that night, Ilse realized she had spent an entire hour talking with an American guard and hadn't once felt afraid. More unsettling, she had enjoyed the conversation. She had felt seen as a person rather than as a prisoner or an enemy. The walls she had built around herself were crumbling faster than she knew how. To rebuild them, the kitchen became a bridge between two worlds. Every morning, a rotating group of German women would report for duty alongside American staff, and in that shared space of food preparation, something remarkable began happening. Language barriers broke down through the universal vocabulary of cooking. Measurements, temperatures, techniques required communication that transcended politics and history. Sergeant Washington proved to be a patient teacher, demonstrating, rather than lecturing, correcting mistakes with gentle redirection rather than criticism. Dora discovered she had an aptitude for baking. Her careful attention to detail made her perfect for measuring ingredients and monitoring oven temperatures. Sergeant Washington began teaching her his biscuit recipe, a closely guarded family secret he claimed his grandmother would haunt him for sharing. "But I figure," he said with a slight smile, "that good food is meant to be passed on, and walls between people don't do nobody any favors." Hedwig, despite her initial resistance to fraternizing with their captors, found herself drawn to the medical precision required for dietary planning. She worked with a camp nutritionist, a lieutenant named Phillips, calculating caloric needs and balanced meals for the entire facility. Her medical training from Stuttgart proved invaluable, and Lieutenant Phillips began consulting her on various health-related food concerns. The professional respect between them was obvious, and Hedwig seemed to grow taller under the acknowledgement of her expertise. Ilse continued working directly with Sergeant Washington on seasoning and preparation. She learned about Southern cooking traditions that stretched back generations, about how food could carry culture and memory across time. The sergeant talked while he worked, his voice steady and educational. He spoke about his childhood in Georgia, about his mother's kitchen, where neighbors would gather every Sunday, about how cooking had been his way of serving during the war when he was too old for combat roles. "Food is honest," he told Ilse one morning while they prepared a large batch of his fried chicken. "You can't lie with food. Either it's good or it ain't. Either you put care into it or you don't. When I cook for folks, I'm telling them they matter enough to receive my best effort. Don't matter if they're generals or privates or prisoners from a country we just fought a war against." One afternoon, Sergeant Washington surprised everyone by asking if any of the German women knew traditional recipes from home. After some hesitation, Hedwig described a potato soup her mother used to make. The sergeant listened carefully, asked questions about proportions and techniques, then announced they would make it for dinner that evening. He adapted the recipe to available ingredients, and let Hedwig take the lead in preparation while he supervised. That night, when the German women tasted food from home, prepared in an American military kitchen with their former enemy's help, several cried again, but these tears were different from the ones shed over fried chicken. These were tears of recognition, of identity affirmed rather than denied. Captain Whitmore, eating her own bowl of potato soup, quietly mentioned that her grandmother had been German, that she had grown up eating similar dishes. The revelation hung in the air like a revelation. These Americans, their captors and former enemies, carried pieces of Germany within their own histories. Late June brought the first wave of mail from occupied Germany. The International Red Cross had been working to establish communication channels between displaced persons and their families, though the process remained chaotic given the devastation across Europe. When Captain Whitmore announced that several letters had arrived for the German prisoners, the women gathered with barely contained anxiety. For many, these would be the first words from home since their capture months earlier. Ilse's name was called. Her hands shook as she accepted the thin envelope, noting immediately that it wasn't her mother's handwriting on the front. Inside, she found a brief letter from a neighbor, Frau Wenzel, who had lived 3 doors down from her family in Cologne. The words were stark and devastating. Her family's apartment building had been destroyed in a bombing raid in March of 1945, just weeks before the war ended. Her mother and younger brother had been killed. Her father's fate was unknown. He had disappeared during the final chaotic days of the war's end. Frau Wenzel wrote that she was sorry to be the bearer of such news, that she had waited months hoping for better information before finally writing. Ilse read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated. Then she walked carefully to her bunk, sat down, and stared at the wall. She didn't cry. She couldn't cry. The grief was too large to fit inside her body. Everything she had endured, all the fear and hardship and hope of eventual reunion, had been for nothing. There was no home to return to. There was no family waiting. There was only absence and destruction and the bitter arithmetic of war. Dora received news that her parents had survived, but their home in Dresden had been destroyed in the firebombing. They were living in a displaced persons camp with thousands of others, struggling to find adequate food and shelter. Her letter was more hopeful than Ilse's, but it still painted a picture of devastation that made the comfortable routine of Camp Hearne seem almost surreal by comparison. Hedwig learned that her elderly mother was alive but gravely ill, being cared for by distant relatives in a town outside Stuttgart. The letter urged her to return as soon as possible if she wanted to see her mother again. Hedwig sat with the letter in her lap for a long time, her face expressionless, but her hands trembling slightly. That evening, the German women gathered in their barracks in subdued silence. More than half had received letters, and none of the news had been entirely good. Even women whose families had survived were learning about destroyed homes, scattered relatives, economic collapse, and widespread hunger. The Germany they had left months ago, already damaged by war, had been further devastated in the final weeks and aftermath of surrender. Private Thatcher, making his evening rounds, noticed the unusual quiet. He approached Corporal Caldwell with concern. "Something's wrong with the German prisoners, sir. They're not talking, not moving much, just sitting there looking lost." Caldwell understood immediately. "Mail came through today. First news from home for most of them." He paused, remembering his own experience receiving difficult letters from family during his deployment. "They're grieving. Give them space, but keep an eye out. Nobody should be alone with that kind of news." The morning after the letters arrived, Ilse moved through her routines mechanically. She reported for kitchen duty because she didn't know what else to do, because the alternative was sitting in the barracks drowning in thoughts about her mother and brother buried under rubble in Cologne. Sergeant Washington took one look at her face and didn't ask questions. He simply handed her vegetables to chop, giving her something concrete to focus on while her world fell apart. But the grief mixed with something else, something darker that had been building since their arrival in America. As more newspapers became available, and as American soldiers talked more freely around the German prisoners, information about concentration camps continued to emerge. Detailed accounts, photographs, testimony from survivors and from Allied soldiers who had liberated the camps. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. During their lunch break, several German women sat in the common area where American newspapers were available. Ilse found herself staring at photographs from Bergen-Belsen, from Dachau, from places she had never heard of despite living in Germany her entire life. The images showed emaciated bodies, mass graves, survivors who looked barely human. The accompanying articles described systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension. "Did you know?" Dora's voice was barely a whisper. She sat beside Ilse, looking at the same photographs. "Did any of us know this was happening?" Hedwig joined them, her face pale. "I heard rumors," she admitted quietly in German. "Near the end, there were whispers about camps, about Jews being sent away, but I told myself it was wartime propaganda, exaggeration. I didn't want to believe our country could do such things." "We wore the uniform," another woman named Gisela said, her voice hollow. "We served the same government that did this. We believed in the same cause. How can we claim innocence when we were part of the machine?" Ilse thought about her time as a radio operator, about the messages she had transmitted without questioning their content or purpose. She thought about the propaganda she had believed, the convenient lies she had accepted because they were easier than asking difficult questions. She thought about the pride she had once felt in serving her country and how that pride now felt like complicity. "What do we tell them?" Dora gestured toward the American soldiers visible through the window. "How do we explain that we didn't know, that we were just doing our jobs, that we thought we were defending our homeland? Will they even believe us?" The question had no easy answer. Corporal Caldwell walked past and saw the women gathered around the newspaper photographs. He stopped, his expression troubled. For a long moment he just stood there, and Ilse wondered what he was thinking. Did he see them as guilty parties? As accomplices to atrocities? As naive young women who had been manipulated by a regime that lied to everyone? Finally, Caldwell spoke, his voice careful. "Those camps, what happened there, that's going to be something your country has to reckon with for a long time, maybe forever. And I won't pretend to know what you all knew or didn't know, what you could have done or should have done differently." He paused, looking at each of them. "But I do know that sitting here right now, looking at those pictures with horror on your faces, that tells me something. Y'all aren't monsters celebrating what happened. You're people learning terrible truths about what was done in your name." The revelation about the camps, combined with the devastating news from home, created a crisis of identity among the German women. They gathered in small groups during free time, speaking in hushed German, trying to process two impossible realities simultaneously. The country they had served had committed atrocities beyond comprehension. The country they would return to was destroyed, offering nothing but rubble and starvation and the judgment of those who had remained. Meanwhile, their daily life at Camp Hearne continued with strange normalcy. They still worked in the kitchen with Sergeant Washington, still attended English lessons with Corporal Caldwell, still received small kindnesses from guards who treated them with more dignity than they felt they deserved. The contrast between their treatment as prisoners and the treatment of concentration camp victims created a moral vertigo that left many of them unable to sleep at night. Ilse found herself having a conversation with Captain Whitmore one evening after English lessons. The captain had asked her to stay behind, ostensibly to discuss translation duties, but the real conversation went deeper. "You've been quieter since the mail came through," Whitmore observed. "I know you received difficult news." "My family is dead," Ilse said flatly. "My mother, my brother, probably my father too. There is nothing left to return to except ruins and guilt." She looked directly at the captain. "Why do you treat us so well? You know what our country did. You've seen the photographs. We wore the same uniform as the people who ran those camps." Captain Whitmore was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I've been thinking about that question myself. about justice and mercy, about collective guilt and individual responsibility. The truth is, I don't have perfect answers, but I know that treating you with cruelty wouldn't undo what happened in those camps. It wouldn't bring back the people who died. It would just add more suffering to an already broken world. Is that enough? Ilsa asked. To simply not add more suffering? Maybe not, Whitmore admitted, but maybe it's a start. Maybe treating former enemies with basic human dignity is how we begin to build something better than what came before. That night, the German women held their most honest conversation since arriving at the camp. Hedwig, always their moral compass, spoke first. We have to decide what we're going to do with what we know now. We can't unknow the truth about the camps. We can't pretend we're innocent victims of circumstance. But we also can't change the past. What choice do we have? Asked Gisela. Repatriation orders will come eventually. We'll be sent back to Germany whether we want to go or not. Dora, usually optimistic, looked uncertain. But what is there to go back to? Destroyed cities, starving people, and everyone knowing what Germany did. We'll carry that shame forever. We should carry it, Hedwig said firmly. We were part of it, even if we didn't understand what we were part of. But the question is whether we carry that shame back to Germany or whether we find another way to make amends. The words hung in the air, unfinished but potent. Another way. The phrase suggested possibilities that none of them had dared to articulate. July 15, 1945. Captain Whitmore called a general. Assembly for all German prisoners at 1000 hours. The women gathered in the main hall with growing anxiety. They had been expecting this moment since their arrival, but now that it appeared to be here, many felt unprepared for what it would mean. The captain stood before them with official documents in hand, her expression professional, but not unkind. I have received orders from the War Department regarding your repatriation to Germany. Processing will begin within 2 weeks. You will be transported to New York, then to ships bound for Europe. From there, you will be processed through displaced persons camps before being released to return to your homes or to family members who can be located. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of reaction through the assembled women. Some looked relieved, finally having a definite timeline for returning home. Others looked stricken, the reality of leaving suddenly concrete rather than abstract. Ilsa felt nothing at Maud. First, just a strange numbness. Return to what? To whom? Captain Whitmore continued. I want you to understand that this repatriation is not a punishment. It's simply the legal process for returning prisoners of war to their home countries now that hostilities have ended. You will be treated humanely throughout the process, and the Red Cross will continue to assist in locating family members. After the official announcement ended, the women were dismissed back to their barracks. But instead of the usual quiet conversations, an intense debate erupted. Some women, particularly those who had received better news from home or who had strong family connections, felt obligated to return despite the devastation. Others, especially those like Ilsa who had lost everyone, struggled to find a reason to go back. That afternoon during kitchen duty, Sergeant Washington noticed Ilsa's distracted state. She had nearly burned a batch of biscuits, something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. What's on your mind? He asked gently. They're sending us back, Ilsa said, in 2 weeks, back to Germany. The sergeant nodded slowly. How do you feel about that? I don't know, Ilsa admitted. I have no family left, no home. I'll return to a country that committed terrible crimes, and everyone will look at me as part of that, even if I didn't know. But this isn't my country either. I'm a prisoner here, an enemy. What right do I have to want to stay? Sergeant Washington was quiet for a moment, stirring a pot of soup with methodical attention. You know, he finally said, my people were brought to this country against their will, enslaved, brutalized, told they didn't belong. But their children and grandchildren built lives here anyway. They found ways to make America their home, even when America didn't want them. I'm not saying your situation is the same, but I am saying that belonging isn't always simple. And sometimes Home is something you choose rather than something you're born into. The words settled over Ilse like a possibility she hadn't allowed herself to consider. Could she choose? Did she have the right to choose? And if she did, what would that choice mean? The discussion among the German women intensified over the following days. Late-night conversations in the barracks became more urgent, more honest. Dora was the first to say out loud what several of them had been thinking. What if we asked to stay? What if we told them we don't want to go back to Germany? The suggestion was met with immediate resistance from some. That's desertion, Gisela said sharply. We can't just abandon our country when it needs rebuilding the most. That's cowardice. But Hedwig, surprisingly, didn't immediately dismiss the idea. Is it cowardice? She asked thoughtfully. Or is it choosing a different way to live with what we've learned? If we return to Germany, we become part of the collective grief and guilt. If we stay here, if they allow us to stay, we become examples of something else, of transformation, perhaps, of former enemies choosing a different path. Ilse listened to the debate with her heart pounding. The idea that had been growing in her mind since her conversation with Sergeant Washington suddenly felt less impossible. I have no family to return to, she said quietly. My mother and brother are dead. My father is missing. If I go back to Germany, I return to nothing but ruins and judgment. Here in this camp, I have found something I never expected: purpose, kindness, the possibility of becoming someone better than I was. The words galvanized others. Anna, a quiet woman from Munich who had lost both parents in the war, spoke up. I feel the same. What future do I have in Germany? I'll be a woman alone in a destroyed country, marked forever as someone who served the regime that caused all this suffering. Over the next 3 days, a group began to coalesce. 12 women, including Ilse, Dora, and surprisingly Hedwig, who discussed the possibility of requesting to remain in America. They understood it was unprecedented, possibly illegal, certainly controversial, but the alternative felt unbearable. On July 18th, they approached Captain Whitmore together. Ilse, as the best English speaker, served as their spokesperson. Her voice shook as she made their request. Captain, we understand that repatriation is the legal process, but we would like to formally request permission to remain in the United States rather than return to Germany. Captain Whitmore's expression revealed complete surprise. You want to stay? As prisoners? Not as prisoners, Ilse clarified. As displaced persons, as immigrants, as whatever legal status would allow us to build new lives here. We have lost our families, our homes. More than that, we have learned truths about our country that make it impossible to return with any sense of pride or belonging. Here, in this camp, we have been treated with more humanity than we deserve. We want the opportunity to earn that humanity, to become better people than we were. The captain sat down slowly, clearly struggling to process this unprecedented situation. I don't even know if what you're asking is legally possible, she said. You're enemy prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires your repatriation. Then help us find another way, Dora said, her English improving with emotion. Please. Captain Whitmore spent the next 2 days sending urgent communications to her superiors in Washington. The situation was unprecedented, and the bureaucratic machinery of the War Department ground slowly as officials debated legal frameworks, political implications, and humanitarian considerations. Meanwhile, news of the German women's request leaked beyond the camp, triggering intense reactions from the surrounding community and eventually reaching local newspapers. The Bryan Daily Eagle ran a front-page story with the headline, German POWs refuse freedom, request to stay in America. The article was surprisingly sympathetic, describing the women's devastating losses and their apparent transformation during their captivity. But it also triggered fierce debate. Letters to the editor poured in, split almost evenly between those who saw the women's request as a heartwarming story of redemption and those who viewed it as an insult to American soldiers who had died fighting Germany. One letter from a mother who had lost her son in the Battle of the Bulge, expressed raw anger. Why should German soldiers, even women, be allowed to stay in our country when my boy died fighting them? They should return to face the consequences of what their nation did. But another letter from a local pastor argued for mercy. These women seek redemption and a chance to build better lives. Isn't that the Christian thing to offer? Inside the camp, the 12 women who had requested to stay found themselves in a strange limbo. Some of the other German prisoners treated them with coldness, viewing their request as betrayal. "You abandon Germany when it needs people most," one woman accused. "You run away instead of helping to rebuild." But others expressed understanding, even envy. "I would stay too if I could," a woman named Petra admitted quietly to Ilse. "But my sister is alive in Hamburg. She needs me. I have to go back, even though I'm terrified of what I'll find there." The American staff seemed divided as well. Private Thatcher was openly supportive, telling anyone who would listen that the women deserved a second chance. Corporal Caldwell was more cautious but sympathetic. "It's complicated," he said when asked his opinion. "They were our enemies, but the war's over. Maybe we could use some examples of how former enemies can become something else." Sergeant Washington, when asked by Ilse what he thought, was characteristically direct. "What I think doesn't matter much in the grand scheme. What matters is what you think, what you're willing to do to make this work if they let you stay. Because it won't be easy. You'll face judgment, suspicion, people who won't forgive where you came from. You'll need to prove every day that you deserve to be here." "I know," Ilse said, "but I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to spend my life proving that people can change, that former enemies can become friends, that redemption is possible even after terrible things." On July 23rd, Captain Whitmore received her response from Washington. She gathered the 12 women in her office, her expression unreadable. "The War Department has made a decision regarding your request," she began. Captain Whitmore held the telegram from Washington, her expression carefully neutral as she addressed the 12 German women crowded into her office. The air felt thick with anticipation and fear. Ilse found herself holding Dora's hand without remembering when she had reached for it. "The War Department will not prevent the repatriation of any prisoner who wishes to return immediately to Germany," Whitmore began, and Ilse's heart sank. But the captain continued. "However, given the exceptional circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wish to remain can be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status under existing refugee provisions." The words took a moment to penetrate. Then Dora gasped, her hand tightening around Ilse's. "We can stay?" she whispered. "It's not that simple," Captain Whitmore cautioned. "You'll no longer be prisoners of war, which means you'll no longer have guaranteed housing and support here. You'll need to find American sponsors willing to vouch for you, secure employment, and find housing in communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. The process could take months, and there's no guarantee of success. You'll be facing significant obstacles." Hedwig spoke up, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "But it's possible? We have a chance?" "You have a chance," Whitmore confirmed. "But I need you to understand what you're choosing. This won't be easy. You'll face suspicion, hostility, people who won't forgive or forget where you came from. You'll need to prove yourselves every single day." That evening, the 12 women who had chosen to stay gathered in the barracks for a final discussion. 2 of them, including Anna from Munich, ultimately decided the uncertainty was too much. They would return to Germany and face whatever they found there with courage. But 10 women, led by Ilse, Dora, and Hedwig, committed to staying and accepting whatever challenges that choice brought. The women who had chosen repatriation began preparing for their departure, packing their few belongings, and saying difficult goodbyes. There was no animosity between the two groups now, only understanding that each woman was making the choice she needed to make given her own circumstances and losses. Finding sponsors proved surprisingly manageable. Corporal Caldwell's sister Ruth, the school teacher from South Carolina, wrote immediately offering to sponsor one of the women. Local church groups, moved by the women's story in the newspapers, stepped forward to help. A Baptist congregation in Bryan offered to sponsor 3 women collectively. A wealthy widow whose son had died in the war shocked everyone by offering to sponsor 2 women, saying that her son would have wanted her to show mercy rather than revenge. Sergeant Washington made arrangements for Ilsa specifically. He had connections with the State Department through his cousin who worked in Washington. They needed translators desperately for processing the thousands of displaced persons arriving from Europe. Ilsa's skills, her fluency in both German and increasingly good English, made her valuable. He wrote letters of recommendation describing her character, her work ethic, and her genuine transformation. Dr. Hayes, the camp medical officer, arranged for Hedwig to continue her medical training in Worcester, Massachusetts. Her experience and knowledge were too valuable to waste, he argued. America needed good nurses, and Hedwig had proven herself capable and compassionate. August 20th, 1945. 2 very different groups of German women prepared to leave Camp Hearne. Those returning to Germany boarded transport trucks in the early morning, their faces reflecting determination mixed with apprehension. Those staying watched them go, knowing they might never see these women again, feeling the weight of having chosen different paths. Ilsa stood with Sergeant Washington as the trucks pulled away. "Do you think we're making the right choice?" she asked quietly. "There's no right choice in situations like this," he replied. "There's only the choice you can live with. You've chosen to build something new instead of returning to something broken. That takes courage." The 10 women who remained were reclassified as displaced persons and moved to temporary housing in Bryan while their immigration paperwork processed. The transition from prisoners to civilians was jarring. Suddenly, they had freedom of movement, but also responsibility for themselves. They needed to find work, learn to navigate American society, and prove to skeptical communities that former enemies could become productive citizens. Ilsa began working for the State Department's Displaced Persons Office in Houston, commuting by bus each day from her small rented room. Her job involved translating documents, interviewing refugees, and helping process the thousands of Europeans seeking new lives in America. The work was exhausting but meaningful. She helped people who, like her, were caught between a destroyed past and an uncertain future. Dora found work as a clerk in a Bryan department store. The owner, Mr. Patterson, had been hesitant to hire a German, but was convinced by his wife, who had befriended Dora through their church. Dora threw herself into the work, determined to prove her worth. She learned American customs, studied product catalogs obsessively, and treated every customer with the kind of careful courtesy that gradually won people over. Hedwig moved to Worcester and began her nursing training at the local hospital. She faced the most direct hostility of any of them, working in a medical environment where many staff had treated wounded American soldiers, but she never complained, never defended herself when people made cutting remarks about her German accent. She simply worked harder than anyone else, stayed later, volunteered for the worst shifts, and gradually earned grudging respect through sheer competence and dedication. The other 7 women found their own paths. Some married American soldiers who had served as guards at Camp Hearne, creating families that embodied reconciliation between former enemies. Others pursued education, learning trades, opening small businesses. Each carried the weight of where they came from, but each also carried the determination to become something better. Sergeant Washington kept in touch with several of them through letters. He wrote to Ilsa regularly, offering encouragement during difficult moments and celebrating small victories. When she received her official immigration approval in 1946, his letter of congratulations included a recipe for his fried chicken. "For when you need to remember," he wrote, "that kindness can change everything." The most profound transformations happened slowly, through accumulated small moments rather than dramatic gestures. A customer in Dora's store who initially refused her service eventually became a regular who requested Dora specifically. A doctor at Hedwig's hospital who had been coldly professional gradually began treating her as a valued colleague. Neighbors who had been suspicious slowly became friendly. June 12, 1965. Ilsa Brandt stood in the kitchen of her home in Houston, Texas, preparing fried chicken for a gathering of friends and family. At 44 years old, she had lived in America for exactly 20 years, half her lifetime, now spent as an American citizen rather than a German prisoner. Her hands moved through the familiar motions of coating chicken pieces in seasoned flour, the recipe committed to memory from countless repetitions. Her husband David, an engineer she had met through work at the State Department, set the table in their dining room. Their two children, Margaret and Thomas, helped with preparations. Both had been born in America and knew their mother's history only through carefully curated stories appropriate for their ages. The doorbell rang. Dora arrived first, now Dora Patterson, after marrying her department store owner's son. She brought her famous potato salad, a hybrid recipe combining German tradition with American ingredients. Hedwig came next, Dr. Hedwig Roth now, still unmarried but fulfilled by her work as head nurse at Worcester General Hospital. She made the trip to Houston once a year for this gathering. Others arrived throughout the afternoon. Corporal Caldwell, now a high school principal in South Carolina, came with his family. Private Thatcher, who owned a farm equipment business in Arkansas, brought his wife and children. Even Captain Whitmore, long retired from the Army, made the journey, but the guest of honor was Sergeant Booker Washington, now in his 60s and retired from the Army. He arrived carrying a covered dish and wearing his familiar expression of quiet dignity. When Ilsa saw him, she felt tears spring to her eyes the way they always did at these annual reunions. They gathered around the table loaded with food, this unlikely family forged through shared history. Before the meal began, Ilsa stood to speak as she did every year. 20 years ago today, I arrived at Camp Hearne expecting cruelty. Instead, I found humanity. 3 days after my arrival, Sergeant Washington served us fried chicken, and some of us cried because we couldn't reconcile the kindness with what we had been taught to believe. She looked around the table at faces that had become as familiar as family. That meal changed my life, not because of the food, though it was the best thing I had tasted in years, but because of what it represented. Someone saw past the uniform, past the nationality, past the war, and chose to offer dignity instead of revenge. Sergeant Washington smiled slightly, uncomfortable with praise as always. "Just did what my mama taught me," he said. "Feed folks with respect, and sometimes that changes things." As they ate together, the conversation flowed easily between remembrance and present life. The children listened to stories about the camp, about the first English lessons, about the day their mother made her unprecedented request to stay in America. Later, as guests began departing, Sergeant Washington pulled Ilsa aside. "You did good," he said simply. "Built yourself a real life here." Ilsa thought about her mother, about the brothers she had lost, about the Germany that existed only in memory now. But she also thought about the choice she had made 20 years ago, asking for a chance she didn't deserve. "Thank you," she finally managed, "for seeing who I could become instead of only who I was."